a little summary, but when we do summaries, I interject some other elements, but I think that auto-poetic network of observations. And then what we did is there is also a self-observation, is always observation of something, and we don't have the observer, transcendental observer of all the observers. How would I say, a perspective of all perspectives which would coincide with God himself. Observation of the world always happens in the world. So in this sense, it's always a perspective on something from somewhere. And then you bring in your Luhmann, and again with one of those phrases that got me thinking for a long time, which is a famous phrase from Luhmann. I mean, you can see what you can see, but you cannot see what you cannot see. And precisely to see what you cannot see, which is the how, you need in fact an observation of the second order. And that's where your whole system is going. And then what you did, I think, very nicely is basically characterizing various levels. You didn't use the term of reflexivity, but I suppose that reflexivity is of course built in. And you described it as, again, starting with two phrases that resonate with me. One, you called it the two mysteries, I mean, the mystery of common sense. And a phrase which I had picked up from Vandenberghe, and which I think is just a beautiful phrase, which, when I was working on conversations, or when I was on internal conversation, which is, we don't have conversations. We are always already in the conversation is in us. Of course, we are always already in the truth, and the truth is in us. And that's exactly what you did by going back by the sensus communis, the hermeneutics, which I think was really beautiful. The common sense is the doxa that we have, and indeed, I mean, it takes a second order observer to basically see, what we cannot see, which is a doxa. So we need an objectivation, as the Bourdieu would say, to be able to see what we cannot see. Then when we move to the person, I mean, of course, with your anti-humanism, and your anti-humanism, of course, is a double one. I mean, with your Luhmann, you already got rid of humanism, and then, of course, with Heidegger, I mean, it becomes a double one. And so the question is then, who observes? Of course, it cannot be the person, because the person is itself the result of an observation. That's what you already had in your PhD. I mean, the person is basically an emanation of the network. And I thought it was really nice what you did, because you actually nicely finished your talk by going back to the recursive self-referential networks, and the person is just that. And another phrase, which is not a stock phrase, perhaps we should have a little booklet with, stock phrases, because you really have an knack for doing that, and which is a phrase that methodology uses, which is basically Garfield, which is there's nothing in the head but brains. And you were basically saying the same. I mean, you don't have to look in the brain, but what you have to look at is precisely the networks of ideas and of connections. And indeed, if you open the head, the only thing you will find is brains. And for us sociologists, brains are not really interesting. So then the question would be, what is interesting for us sociologists, and how do you deal with this transition between, the hard sciences, sociology, and philosophy? So just summarizing, I thought your talk was absolutely beautiful, because you have these beautiful phrases, and you translate very, very difficult things into crisp, provocative language. And you have also a very good sense of movements, circularities. It's almost like, I would say, a fuga by Bach, but kind of remixed by a contemporary DJ. So thank you. And with this, I open to the floor for discussions. As I said in the beginning, I'm only the MC. I'm here to make sure that everybody feels at ease, that the communication keeps on going, and that the time it's 5:15, 5:20, that you're not exhausted, but that you're energized. So please help me just by coming up with your questions, and you can ask them in English, you can ask them in Portuguese, you can ask them in German, and we can translate. I mean, what is important is exactly that the communication circulates and that you can all contribute. Please come perhaps to the front, or fica à vontade, né? Pode ser em português neste caso.
Obrigado. Well, first of all, I'm Francesco Rubino from Italy. I'm a visiting professor here. So I'm a kind of observer. And first of all, thank you for this rich and very enriching speech, for your suggestions. I read your essays and books, and I'm very interested and concerned about your problematic. And just a small and a straight question, my friend. Are you dealing with a kind of unnatural observer? Secondly, well, I'll say that the theory of the observer is the crucial problem of science at all. Not of science only, of course, but it is a crucial problem of science at all. Science as such. But it is not the problem of science only. We have observers in art and literature, and we have observers in psychoanalysis, and in this dealing with this sort of other as an observer, we can see that this observer sees more than he can see. He listens to more than he can listen to. What is your perception?
Do you want to take one more question, or do you want to take one question and elaborate it? That's up to you.
Yeah, one more question.
One more question. Okay, I see that Jaime is thinking. I see someone at the back as well who's ready to come up with a question. Raquel is also quite.
O Jaime acho que tá elaborando.
So we'll start with the first one. They are still thinking, and with this small intermediary phase, you also had time to think.
Yeah, the question of the plurality of observers. Yes, in modernity, with Luhmann functional differentiation, there are very many different observers, and one sign of modernity is that there is no observer that contains all other observers. So there is no mega observer. There is no longer anything like an absolute observer that would be, a God or some kind of other metaphysical being. So the modern reality is a pluralism of observers, each of which has its own limits, each of which observes according to its own mode of observing. And so there is no way in which all these different observers can be merged into a meta observer any longer. And so I will, at some point during these 3 days, hopefully talk a bit more about the end of the hierarchical observer, because the hierarchical observer is the observer of metaphysics, that is a privileged observer in some ways. And so once metaphysics comes to an end, all we have is a plurality of observers.
You want to relaunch the discussion? You have with the response? You want to make it more dialogical? Please go ahead.
If you allow me.
Sure.
But I still think, if you allow me to remark that, I still think that the problem with the plurality of observer still remains that we have a sort of a field of the observation that is vaster than the field of the observed. And this is the problem, in my view, because we are dealing with a new, not only in my view, I'm a social scientist, so in my view, we are not dealing with a new, with a plurality of observers. In my view, we are dealing with a new kind of observer. There is an observer who came after scientific revolutions and not before scientific revolution. The foreword written by Kuhn to his reprint of the structure of the scientific revolution, and it is also a remark made against himself by Kuhn himself when he wrote the foreword to the Rhodesian structure. So we are dealing with an observer who came after scientific revolutions. And so his field is vaster, and he knows more than he can know. That's why I brought up the example of psychoanalysis, where we have two observers dialectically working, let's say that, and everybody of them knows more than he can know.
Perhaps I would say that different observers don't know more than other observers, they just know in different ways. But I don't think it is any longer possible really to arrange observers in some kind of a hierarchy, where you have observers who know more and observe more, and other observers who observe less. I don't think it's possible to quantify that any longer. So I would say different observers just observe the world in different ways, in different modes, according to different paradigms. But in modernity, in advanced modernity especially, it is no longer possible to arrange observers in a hierarchical order of levels of knowing where knowledge increases gradually or cumulatively.
And the observed field, what about the observed field? Can it be hierarchically structured?
I would say the observed, let's say the observed is the object. Then we can say the object is disclosed in different ways by different observers. But we cannot say that one observer observes the truth about the object, whereas the other observers are in error or are mistaken. So different observers observe the object, the referent, the observed in different ways, according to different modes. But we can no longer say that these modes are arranged or structured like a nested hierarchy.
Someone? Sure.
Question. I was thinking about the question of meaning. Meaning is the field where observation occurs. But when you talk about common sense, you said it's not a way of knowledge, but causes to attribute meaning to things in life. And common sense also influences science. For instance, the difference between mind and body. What I'm a little confused is about the boundaries, about observation, common sense, science, and ways of attributing meaning. But I think that there are several places where they're confused. And how can we think? How can we separate and how can we think about knowledge, about knowing? If it is, if the know at which level it occurs.
Yeah, common sense and science are both two observers, but they are not related with common sense or science, or that science is superior to common sense, because science has its own common sense in its routine normal mode. So the common sense of a science is that which everyone doing that science tacitly in that paradigm, within which it uses the paradigm as a resource, but never as a topic. In order to do that, one must go to scientific revolutions. Then the resource does turn into a topic as a normal science. Science observes the truth, whereas common sense is stuck in superstition. The difference is that common sense occurs within the science as well. So it is, I think, not correct, and that probably goes back to your question as well. How can we compare different observers with regard to the truth? The truth of a science remains its own. And so it cannot really move out of it or beyond it. It can expand itself, it can expand its domain, if you will, but the truth of a science ends when and where that science itself ends. And so the truth remains the truth of a science, and it cannot be exported outward unless, of course, a domain increases, and that happens under certain conditions. For example, when one's scientific specialty colonizes, occupies another. For example, economics, the intrusion of economics into sociology in the form of rational choice. So, a science can expand its truth, but only if it also expands its institutional and disciplinary apparatus. And that happens, of course, under certain conditions.
Truth as validity or as efficacy, Professor? As validity, truth as validity, validated by procedure, eventually, or truth as efficacy, working theories.
Yes, exactly. So the distinction between validity and efficacy is such that if a science manages to extend its organizational apparatus into other sciences, then at the same time it exports its validity into other sciences. That is what sociologically is reduction. Reduction is not so much a philosophical problem, it is a sociological problem, and a science is reduced to another science when that science becomes colonized by the other sciences, disciplinary mechanisms and institutional apparatus. That, of course, can happen. So regimes of truth can expand, but they can only expand when the corresponding regime of power expands as well.
Someone else, please?
Two questions. How, if it's, I don't know, if it's possible, in your opinion, that a theory of observer can contribute to the debate about fake news, truth, post-truth, obviously in the academic area, in a scientific manner, not in the public debate, but how and if this theory can contribute to this debate in the scientific field. The first one question. The second one is, we know that humans use the term semantics, distinguishing two levels, cultivated semantic and popular semantic. Which is the relationship between common sense and semantics in your opinion, and these two levels of semantics in your opinion?
In regard to your first question, it is probably important to recall the distinction between truth and reality. And there is a difference between the two. Truth is not the same as reality. Reality is not the same as truth. So, if we draw that distinction between truth and reality, then truth and false are both, but they're not both true. And so, when we adopt that distinction, And then we can say that post-truth, post-fact, and so forth are real, but they're not true. One can have the one without the other. The second question about common sense and semantics. Common sense is its own semantics. The semantics just means the meaning that is the within and out of which common sense operates, the horizon, the light out of which it operates. And so I think what Luhmann means by semantics is a network of difference in science, and common sense can be interpreted in terms of that.
You want to relaunch that? You're happy with the answer? Very good. Someone else? Okay, just to keep the conversation going. I mean, you say, going from systems theory, your observation, I mean, a pluralistic conception. I mean, you cannot have just an object and different perspectives on the world, because every perspective, every observer can only observe what it can observe in its own terms. And of course, that's a nice mixture in terms of your trajectory, where you do Luhmann and you bring science studies together. But then my question, in fact, is about how you move from Luhmann to Heidegger. I mean, this is a long trajectory for sure. But isn't it, or they actually compatible? I mean, in the sense that with the theory of the observer, a la Luhmann, it's all about knowing. Of course, with Heidegger, you get one different dimension altogether. And that's where the three constructivisms, in fact, where they do not match. I mean, in the sense that you do a systemic constructivism. Of course, every perspective on the world complexifies the world from in the world. But what you have with Heidegger, I think, is deconstruction, is destruction, is exactly something happens with the theory of the observer, is the elimination exactly of all the clutter of the sciences, and you move from a realm of knowing to a realm of being. So I'm actually wondering if with all, the Luhmannian presuppositions that, you can actually never get out of it's always constructed, and you can only construct, you never get out of it. I think that with Heidegger something else is going on, and you actually move beyond the theory of the observer. And I'm actually thinking of a phrase, I think it comes from Leibniz, which is when you actually join all the perspectives on the world and you put them all together, what you have actually is the world itself. I mean, if you think that through in kind of with its mystical illumination, with the clearing that comes, I mean, I think that is exactly what happens with Heidegger. So my question would be, how have you moved from Luhmann to Heidegger? And is it a one-way street, or does it lead into the whole street?
Yeah, the transition from Luhmann to Heidegger is a transition from a metaphysical sociology, which is Luhmann, to a post-metaphysical mode of thinking. And so the relationship is first that Luhmann and Heidegger think the being of the human being in very different terms. For Luhmann, the being of the human being is a psychical system. For Heidegger, the being of the human being is Dasein. And so that is the first major difference. The other difference is an approach in what is truth. For Heidegger, the truth is the truth of being, and what being is approximately is the world. Yeah? When you wonder what is being in Heidegger, then a rough approximation of what it means by being is world. So, for Heidegger, truth is the truth of an historical world. There is no truth outside and above it anymore, because the end of metaphysics means the dissolution of the absolute, the evaporation of the absolute. Once that happens, once the what Nietzsche observes as the coming of nihilism, once that occurs, it is no longer possible to observe the world as such from the vantage point outside of it. So I do not think that we can add up all the different perspectives. That's like having a pie and you have various slices in it and you add all the slices and then you have the whole pie. That is not how the truth of a world can be related to the truth of a different world. So it depends on the truth of a world as it is, for example, in the classical Greek, or in the medieval world, or in the modern world. They cannot be arranged as a successive approximation towards the truth. Rather, they can only be seen as we have to understand when we follow Heidegger that world is not a noun but a verb. So the world worlds and the world worlds in many different ways, and the world worlds according to very many different distinctions. So you have the Platonic distinction, for example, between the idea and the sensory reality. You have a medial distinction between God and world, and then you have the modern distinction between subject and object. I do not think that if we add up all these different historical worlds, then we end up with a world as such, or with the whole world, or the totality of it. I only think there are historical modes of worlding.
But don't they all kind of somehow lift the veil on something which is coming into existence? And of course, what you would have with Heidegger, you would move from knowing to being. And of course, you cannot get there. But of course, what you would, I mean, if you do it with Luhmann, I mean, then it is, of course, you never get out of the system. There's nothing there. It's empty. I mean, in what you have in Heidegger, exactly where the clearing is. That's exactly, I mean, the unsick, the being that manifests itself. I mean, I think there's something there which means that through Heidegger, actually, you get outside of Luhmann and something else is happening. I mean, that's what I was getting at, is the destruction. Is it not exactly in Heidegger where you get outside of the system and you get into reality itself, you get into the truth itself. The truth actually is not something that you have, but you are in the truth. I mean, isn't there something that, it may be that the two are incompatible? That there's something else going on, and moving beyond metaphysics means moving into the truth. And I think that if you do that, probably you get rid of Luhmann, which would not be such a bad thing, I think.
Yeah, again, the distinction, the core distinction of the observer Luhmann is the distinction between system and environment. So the subject becomes system, the object becomes environment. And the mode of operation changes as well. The mode of operation of consciousness, of the subject is consciousness. The mode of operation of the system is communication. So it's a movement from consciousness to communication. However, Luhmann understands consciousness in the Husserlian way, and not in the Hegelian way. For Hegel, consciousness is nothing inside. Neither is it anything outside. Rather, for Hegel, consciousness is an in-between. Luhmann's notion of consciousness is very traditional. For Luhmann, consciousness, psychical system, is the center of intentional acts. So it is an inside. That's a very traditional metaphysical notion that does not even reach the height of Hegel. So the movement from Hegel to Luhmann is actually a reduction in the notion of consciousness. For Hegel, consciousness is not the center of intentional acts, and meaning is nothing inside the mind. Meaning is not the relationship between a consciousness and an object, and an intentional relation between consciousness and an object. For Hegel, meaning is much closer to what Heidegger means by meaning. Meaning is the within and out of which something appears. And so we need to move beyond Luhmann, and we can do so with Hegel and then with Heidegger.
I think Jaime is almost ready now with the elaboration of his questions. Some other questions, some other interjection?
A teoria do observador lida com as críticas tradicionais às teorias do construtivismo. Ao longo da palestra, eu ouvi o professor falar no a priori histórico, falar dos paradigmas do conto, lembro de algumas críticas clássicas que são feitas a esse respeito. Tem a do Habermas, a respeito da contradição performativa que ele faz no discurso filosófico da modernidade, tem as críticas do Lacan sobre o conflacionismo. Todas elas versam sobre o papel da cumulatividade, da capacidade de fazer distinções entre juízos verdadeiros e falsos. Como é que essa teoria lida com essas críticas mais tradicionais feitas na psicologia, na teoria do conhecimento? E se ela aborda essas discussões, ou preserva alguma delas?
This question is how, from the point of view of your theory of the observer, what do you do? Because in your talk you were talking about the a priori and the common sense, and of course even in your answer about Heidegger you were basically suggesting that the a priori is always historical.
Yeah.
So his question is the historical a priori. I mean, is kind of fine, but at the same time very problematic. Habermas himself said this is a performative contradiction. Either you have a historicity or you have a priori. How do you pass that problem from, let's say, in terms of your theory of observation? Isa? Sí.
It is indeed a performative contradiction to call an a priori historical, but only as long as we understand the a priori in Kantian terms. In Kantian terms, the a priori is indeed transcendental, and that means two things. Kant has two criteria for when something is transcendental, and that means it is universal and necessary. That is, it cannot be otherwise. And I don't think that is possible anymore. I don't think it is possible to have a pure a priori in the Kantian sense. I don't think it's possible to have an absolute in the Hegelian sense anymore either. I think that is no longer a possibility for thinking. That is no longer a possibility for thinking after the end of metaphysics. So we have to come to terms with the ending of metaphysics. And what that means is that any a priori is local, is historical. It is no longer pure transcendence, because we can no longer think of the subject as a subject of logic, which is the logic of the subject. That is no longer possible, that is no longer an option.
We are now almost coming to the end of the session. Jaime wants to have a replica. Please feel free.
Mention himself was struggling with thought. He tried to reformulate and when he thinks about the transcendental, one of the two conditions, unity and the necessity, he was, I think, trying to put all the conditions about the image of objectivity, or a condition of the possibility of thinking of an object like an object.
Yeah.
If you abolish these two criteria, what is the kind of objectivity that is possible to think in a theory? Or this is not more a question?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that for Kant, the subject is the condition of the possibility of the object. Experience is the synthesis between subject and object. But I do not think that it is possible any longer to think of objectivity in terms of universality. Rather, objectivity must be thought as the objectivity of a particular historical mode of worlding within which objectivity occurs. But I do not think that there is an objectivity that transcends history. I don't think there is such a thing, unless we are willing and daring to think the absolute. And I don't see anyone who is ready and prepared to do that.
Okay, well, we are now reaching the end of your first class. Could you just quickly give us a little preview of what is going to happen tomorrow before we wrap up?
To observe is to draw a distinction, and the theory of the observer distinguishes between two modes of observing. One is the difference between first and second order observing, so that will become a topic. And then the next topic will be the distinction between hierarchical and lateral observing, where hierarchical observing is basically metaphysical observing, and lateral observing is post-metaphysical observing. So these two distinctions between first and second order and hierarchical lateral, those will be in the center of the next 2 days. And then hopefully the third day, when if we have time enough, then we get to variations in observers and what explains such variations. So then we move much more to a sociological theory of the observer, and here the idea will be to explain the conditions under which an observer sees itself as realist, or under what conditions an observer sees itself as more relativist or constructivist. The principal idea will be that while all observers are constructed, not all of them are constructivist.
Well, the topic of today was it again constructivism? And now for those who are taking the class, and the topic for your homework will be, we've been observing the system, and so the question is who has been observing, what has been observed, and how has been observed. And how long does it have to be? 2 pages? Yeah. So that's for the homework, and so now I'm going to officially close the session of today. Stephan will go outside to have a smoke. The smokers can join him. And if you want to have other discussion, just get in touch with me, with anyone here. You know, this is a collective enterprise. And once again, thank you very much to our speaker. Thank you very much to the local organizer, and thank you very much to the public as well. Let's give
Então, amanhã nós seguimos no mesmo horário e eu já deixo o convite na quarta-feira, no último dia diferente. À noite nós vamos nos reunir em algum bar da cidade, portanto, se vocês puderem já deixar isso agendado para ter um momento de confraternização. A nossa ideia inicial é num bar que se chama Sank, que fica em frente ao Parcão. Depois eu passo o endereço, amanhã eu trago o endereço mais certinho. Deixa eu só interromper.
Vocês vão voltar para Paris? Você volta comigo?
Se for...